Thank you, Lorcan. Not sure if this table is leanable, but I'll give it a try, and you can all pick me up if I fall. Sorry, I was just running around there because between the jigs and the reels, it ended up that my laptop is being used next door, and I'm using one that's supplied by the hosts here. So I just was trying to make sure that the meeting next door. Thank you so much for coming. Anyway, I'm surprised to see so many people here because there's so many other good sessions on, and I'm looking forward to. I would have gone to one of the other ones myself, actually, if I hadn't had to be at this one, and I'm looking forward to some good ones later in the day. This is new to me. This is kind of weird for me. Obviously, I wrote this book last year. I've been writing about it. I've done a lot of interviews about it, but I haven't really had to do a spiel about it. And for some reason, even though I'm a lecturer as my day job, getting up and doing a spiel, which is in effect a kind of a defense of this book that I've written, is quite nervous-making. So bear with me and save your heckling till the end, maybe. If you want to be controversial, we can maybe be controversial in about 3/4 an hour's time. I'm planning to finish with plenty of time to. You give me a heads up about the time. Thanks, Lorcan, if you would. So this is, as I say, the talk. For those of you who don't know, it's the talk of the book. The book is The Frontman, Bono in the Name of Power, which is published by Verso earlier this year, and. Your expectation of what the talk might consist of, based on, if you haven't read the book and based on what you've heard about it, might be something along these lines. This was a building site hoarding in the Dublin 8 a couple of years ago with one of the many sort of graffiti that pop up around the city. I believe it's all done by 1 or 2 people, actually. And I am not one of them, I promise. And I mean, it's a magnificent word, poxbottle. I'm not quite sure what it means, but it's a word that's unique, I believe, to inner city Dublin as well. So it's a great kind of way in which Dublin sort of speaks back to its favorite son. But if this is what you're expecting, you may be a little bit disappointed, because I kind of take Bono seriously, and insofar as I can, I actually am partly about dispelling some of the negative myths about Bono. So this is our friend Claire Daly, who spoke very well when Michelle Obama was in town and the G8 were meeting in Fermanagh earlier this year. And she said that there'd been special news bulletins covering what Michelle and her daughters had for lunch, but very little questioning of the fact that she had lunch with Mr. Tax Exile, Bono, which was quite a strong statement to make, and it was one that I think had a lot of resonance for people, especially since tax avoidance was one of the subjects on the agenda at the G8 in Fermanagh this year. The fact is, it's just not true. Bono's not a tax exile. He's resident for tax purposes in Ireland. We don't know exactly how much tax he pays, but we do know that he doesn't do what, say, Dennis O'Brien or before him, Tony O'Reilly, did in terms of living abroad. The arrangements by which Bono moved their music publishing to Amsterdam in 2006 was in keeping with a long tradition in U2 of behaving like a corporation and paying its taxes as efficiently as possible, tax competitiveness, as Bono calls it. And insofar as I have a difficulty with Bono about tax, it's much more the way that he's sought to justify it. That is tax avoidance, which all of the U2 companies are involved in doing, in terms of that it's broadly beneficial to the Irish economy. Sure, we took our money abroad, other people take their money here, it's all good, it's tax competitiveness, it's part of the global flow of capital, and it's been a net benefit to Ireland. I think that he could make that argument probably with some credibility 6 or 7 years ago when he started making the argument. To make it after 2008 showed an extraordinary blind spot and a tin ear, indeed, to what's happened in Ireland. He was still talking in 2009, for example, about the wonderful financial architecture in Ireland by which companies were invited to come and avoid tax here. At that point, the financial architecture had been shown to be essentially built with kind of twigs and straw, and it collapsed. But the idea that he doesn't pay tax in Ireland, a favorite meme on 1,000 internet threads is just not true. Another one, Bono's charity wastes money on salaries that it should be giving to the poor. This story came from a report done by the Daily Mail in 2010. Bono's one foundation under fire for giving little over 1% of funds to charity. And the idea was that this organization, which is not a foundation, the one campaign, was only gave a few bob to directly to help the poor in Africa, while keeping most of its money for PR, for salaries, etc. Well, insofar as, you know, if you acknowledge that it's not a foundation, otherwise that headline is accurate. But they were only under fire insofar as the Daily Mail was doing a story about it, because one is not a foundation and it's not a charity and it doesn't pretend to be. Bono's one organization is a campaign and lobbying organization. So you would expect that it would spend most of its money on salaries and PR. That's what campaigning and lobbying organizations do. I have a lot of questions that we'll get to later about what one actually does and for whom. But the idea that it's a sort of a scam, that it's one of these alleged charities that actually spends all its money on overheads, it doesn't actually give any money to the target audience, is not true. And in fact, one doesn't really even invite donations from the public. So it's not as though people are being, you know, say, give your money to one and it's going to help the developing world. One is largely funded by Bill Gates, to a lesser extent by Warren Buffett and George Soros. It's not funded by Bono, by the way. He's always been quite strict about that. When he set up the predecessor to one, it only needed $1.5 million, $2 million, and he raised it. He got somebody to convince Bill Gates to give the money rather than spending his own money. But it's not the case that it's a kind of a scam charity. Mother Records, founded in 1984 by U2, is the subject of a lot of kind of you know, gossip in the Dublin music scene, and this you know, and of course online as well. And this sentence that I've sort of summarized it with here: Bono and U2 use their record label to deliberately thwart the careers of potential Irish rivals. Hey, that band's really good. Let's sign them up and then do nothing with them, so that their careers stall and we still remain the only important Irish band. Now, there are people who are in a position to have some knowledge of this situation who will still insist to me that this is the case. Insofar as I was able to look into it and talk to people who I trusted from within the industry, I came to the conclusion that Mother Records, insofar as it did a lousy job promoting the careers of other Irish bands, and it did do a lousy job, did that lousy job out of basic incompetence and, you know, the random difficulties of a music industry, and the fact that U2 had more on their mind in the mid-1980s than looking after a bunch of their pals. They were looking after themselves. They were on their way to being the biggest band in the world at the time. So this kind of gossip, this rumor about Mother Records, it seems to me, is unsupportable, and it's one of the things that I dispel in the book. And then finally there's this one, which is sort of, and our first picture of the man himself. Bono just does his anti-poverty work for the publicity, the glory, and to sell more records. This is all an ego trip for him, and a cynical one at that, one that is designed to allow him to get into the limelight. Oh, U2 must have a new record coming out. Bono is trotting around the world meeting the Pope and everybody else, and you know, so, and that's a pretty common account of, you know, what motivates him. Well, I guess what I can say about this is I don't know. I don't know what motivates him. I know what he says motivates him, but I also know what he does, and he does a lot. And he does a lot that is in places and spaces that aren't really very lucrative for him. He's not, in other words, always hogging the limelight in order to do his, if you like, his philanthropic work. He does it at a pretty low profile quite a lot of the time. He spends a lot of time on it. So I have to come to the conclusion, although I can't say that I do know what motivates him, I can't see a pattern that suggests that it is simply sort of glory-seeking or record selling as his motivation. So what can we say about him if we're going to start throwing abuse at him? Can we say he's a hypocrite? For sure, yeah, for sure, right? You know, I'm a hypocrite. Probably most of you, if you were to kind of examine your hearts and find the gaps between what you espouse and what you've done at times, you would probably have to come to the conclusion that hypocrisy is kind of the human condition. So insofar as Bono's a hypocrite, I'll take that. Check, yeah, he's a hypocrite, and I'll say, so what? You know, it seems to me that if we take Bono seriously, it has to be beyond the level of this kind of abuse. I don't understand Bono's psychology. I don't pretend to. I didn't talk to him for writing the book. The book is based on the public record. Insofar as I've come to grasp certain aspects of Bono's thinking, and I think I have, it's partly because I think that I recognize characteristics that I share with him, not his talent or his sort of charisma. But there are other qualities and histories that I do have in common with Bono. And I'm not really joking when I say, and I say it all the time, there but for the grace of God go I. The spaces that Bono has come to occupy in the kind of the global imagination and in his own imagination, it's not terribly surprising that he goes on to serve the things that he does. And so what do I mean by that? What is he serving? Why do I want to, why have I written a book that has a go at Bono? Because I don't hate him. I know a lot of people think they hate Bono. I'm not one of those people. I don't care about his vanity, his hypocrisy, his piety. All those things are real, but they're not things that would motivate me to hate somebody. But I am angered by him, and I'm angered by a lot of what he stands for. But it's not to say that he stands for those things because of malign intentions. So what's that role that I say that he occupies? I say that he's basically a spokesmodel. He's a spokesmodel for the virtues of neoliberal capitalism. He's someone whose role has become to confer sort of grace and integrity on a system that continues to be a system of murderous exploitation. And that grace and integrity, by the way, is something that he sort of, unlike other celebrity humanitarians, something that he brought from the cultural realm into the realm of politics. In other words, we already believed, we knew Bono was a person of kind of morality, honesty, integrity, and decency from his music. And he was able to bring that and bring it to the realm of politics, unlike, say, a kind of a George Clooney, who we knew was very handsome from his movies, but we only sort of, he only becomes a humanitarian when he transfers the good looks and the flashing the camera to Darfur. It's a little bit different with Bono because I think his character is part of what makes him sort of desirable from the point of view of those who he represents. So I challenge the politics of Bono's global work, not because I want to discredit him personally, but because he stands for the general principle that the rich and powerful are the ones whose good intentions we can depend upon to make the world a more just and equal place. For the ideas of philanthro-capitalism, the idea that sort of business and doing good can work together in the developing world, the charitable industrial complex, which I'll get to later. And he suggests, and what his message is that those ideas are more powerful and ultimately beneficial than, say, democracy and real popular movements for change. So he stands for tax avoidance, for example, the corporate practice of tax avoidance. He stands for a sort of a techno-utopianism where Bill Gates, his main sponsor, is the personification of enlightenment. Facebook, in which he owns quite a few shares, is kind of the vanguard of revolution, as he's put it in Egypt. And open data, the collation of open data is always the route to liberation. He stands for multinational corporations, their phony claims to humanitarianism. He stands for American evangelical Christians and their right-wing agenda in Africa. He stands for distortions of the recent history of the war and peace in Ireland. I'm not going to touch on that in this, but I'd be happy to talk about it afterwards. And he stands for a distortion of the reality of global poverty reduction in order to claim that all of his approaches work. And finally, he stands for a set of unaccountable NGOs and foundations, his organizations, but also more importantly, the likes of Gates, that increasingly are making policy in the developing world unaccountable and undemocratic. My book was part of a series that Verso did called Counterblasts. And if you look at the covers, the Jeffrey Sachs one is still to be published. The other ones, I think, have all appeared by now. Something quite different about the cover of my one, which is that there's someone else on the cover with him. And, that's partly to sort of, have a Yabu hiss figure there to go with Bono. But it's also, I think, appropriate because I think the story of Bono's politics is a story about a set of relationships. Relationships where I think you can argue that the likes of George W. Bush have exploited that credibility and that grace that Bono brings. The relationships, the fact that he has a relationship with Jesse Helms, George W. Bush, Tony Blair, is a little bit grotesque in some ways, but it's not fundamentally my problem. The argument that he would make and that his defenders would make, that sometimes to get things done you have to deal with assholes, that's a powerful argument. But my case is really about the outcomes of the relationships that Bono forms, that he's not given a little to these characters in order to gain a lot for the poor, on the contrary. The Spanish edition of the book has just been published, and it also went with the kind of the double shot, you know, the idea that there's two of them in it. As I say, and these people like to stand beside Bono because of what he brings. So I want to run through some of these sort of key relationships quickly. Can you believe he was ever that young? It is, this is Garrett Fitzgerald, for those of you who are too young to remember him. He was Taoiseach on a couple of occasions, but mainly through a coalition government between '83 and '87. And Bono was a huge admirer of Garrett, and this was a sort of a campaign photo op that Bono did with Garrett. And he also, when Fitzgerald went into government, Fitzgerald set up a kind of a national youth policy committee that Bono served on. It was basically, you know, optics during a time of very high youth unemployment, emigration, etc. And Bono sort of allowed himself to be used to give credibility to this organization. So although I think Bono's politics in the 80s are actually largely, in international terms, are much better than what came to characterize him in the late 90s and early 21st century, there was something about Bono that was drawn to service to power at some level, even at this early stage. The irresistible nature of apparently having the ear of power and having apparent influence there. Bush Sr. made the mistake of not having a relationship with Bono. And he, on the contrary, he mocked him during the 1992 presidential election campaign when Bono met with Bill Clinton, when U2 met Bill Clinton, and Clinton was basically showing that he was down with the kids, and U2 were extremely, obviously, popular at the time. Bush went on television and mocked Clinton for meeting with U2, and he said, if Clinton gets elected, U2 will have to pay higher taxes. U2 will, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And so when Clinton won that election in '92, two members of U2, though not Bono himself, were played at the inaugural ball, and Clinton's election was seen as a kind of an immense breakthrough moment. And Bono really, I think, politically never recovers from the spectacle of being first abused by this president, but loved by his successor. Sorry, so there he is in more recent times with Bill, and we know that Bono did his Clinton imitation at the meeting of the Clinton Global Initiative there a few weeks ago, and Clinton put on some pink sunglasses and did his Bono imitation, and they're loving pals, but have been really since 1992. This is a funny picture I found on a YouTube fan site with Tony Blair, and again, this was a very important relationship that these two formed. I'll definitely be talking a little bit more about that later on. Gordon Brown. Yeah, that's quite an embrace, isn't it? I think he was just trying to show off the sunglasses, but I think Bono was influential in getting Browne some American award as International Statesman of the Year a few years ago in the brief flourishing of Browne's career in the late noughties. But Browne was also instrumental in kind of launching Bono's career as an activist. His proper career as an activist really doesn't start until 1998-99 when he hooks up with the Drop the Debt campaign. Bono will often talk about sort of 25 years of activism, etc. But really, during the 90s, he did very little, never went to Africa, wasn't really involved in campaigning work. Certainly in the early mid-90s, he certainly wasn't. But in 98-99, he joins up with Drop the Debt. He does a appearance at the Brit Awards in which he sort of mouths about the need to drop the debt. He writes an editorial for The Guardian in the same week about, you know, third world debt angers me was the headline. Perfectly decent cause and a decent editorial. And within a few days, Browne was making a speech basically associating the British government with this campaign and saying, we admire the activism of people like Bono. Bono was barely a wet week as an activist at this point, and Browne was up making a speech saying that, you know, it's the work of people like Bono that have really inspired us to get on board with this campaign. This, of course, was an extraordinary piece of kind of whitewashing this government, which was involved in well, first of all, it was largely carrying on the policies of the Tory administration that had preceded it, but also continuing the kind of the war on working class Britons and getting relatively cheap credibility for its work on global development issues. So Bono was essentially part of a campaign which had many good qualities, the Jubilee debt campaign, but which was also employed by the British government to give it a kind of a liberal internationalist veneer at a time when it was actually up to very little good in any case. This is Bobby Shriver. Bobby Shriver, as his smile might indicate, is a Kennedy. His mother is Eunice, and he was Bono's contact point when he, just after the first encounters with Gordon Brown and campaigning in 1999, when he decided that he needed to take the argument to the United States. The U2 knew the Kennedys already in their kind of celebrity circles, and Eunice said to him, call my Bobby, he'll sort you out in Washington. Bobby had been working for an investment bank run by James Wolfenson, who Clinton had just appointed to be president of the World Bank at this point. So Bobby was extremely well connected in Washington, obviously, but also on Wall Street. And very quickly, Bono kind of entered this world, this kind of corporate philanthropic government nexus that the likes of Bobby Shriver, but sort of David Rockefeller, eventually then sort of Bill Gates and people like that. But Shriver is his initial guide and helps to ensure that Bono's politics and policy prescriptions operate very much within the framework dictated by what we might call the Washington Consensus. That he's on board, in other words, with all of the kind of conditionalities that Washington wants to put on aid and debt relief for the developing world in terms of liberalization, privatizations, facilitation of foreign investment, dropping of agricultural tariffs, etc. And this is his sort of philosopher on that, in that realm. This is Jeffrey Sachs. They're pictured for GQ here. Jeffrey Sachs was, when Bono first went to the States, a professor at the JFK School of Government at Harvard, and now is a professor of economics at Columbia in New York. He has made some noises in sort of support of the Occupy movement, and he's a big campaigner for the developing world, but he's also the very same economist who produced shock doctrine economics in the former Soviet Union after 1990, and helped to ensure that life expectancy, nutrition, etc., were collapsed in those places at that time. Now, Sachs is the subject of a new book from Verso coming out in a few months, which sort of makes the connection between his form of economics as it was practiced in the former Soviet Union and the form that he practices in relation to the developing world today. So I won't try to go there, but Bono wrote the foreword for Sachs's book, The End of Poverty, and essentially drew his prescriptions for how to end poverty very much from the world of, from the intellectual world of Sachs. And then obviously there's this relationship. This picture is from the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington, where Bono was a prominent speaker. And we talked a little bit about Bush already, and we'll talk a little bit more about him. But I just wanted to use this one from the Prayer Breakfast to kind of stand in for a set of relationships that Bono forms in the early 2000s with the Christian right in America, not only with George W. Bush, but with the likes of Jesse Helms, a notorious, unrepentant, racist senator from North Carolina. I just heard a story about him on the radio, on an American radio program today, Helms, when Carol Moseley Braun was elected to the Senate, and she was the only black member of the Senate at that time. Helms walked into a lift where she was riding and started singing Dixie tour. And he said to the other senator he was there, he said, I'm going to make her cry. I'm going to keep singing until she cries. Helms never, that was Helms, and Helms, I really should have a picture of Bono with Helms, because Bono found Helms a redeemable character, and maybe he would have been a redeemable character indeed, you know, if what Bono could get delivered by the George W. Bush and the Jesse Helms of the world could actually transform the lives of the world's majority poor, I would argue. This relationship may be the most important one of all. That's Bill and Melinda Gates. They were the joint People of the Year, and the connection between the Gateses and Bono is a very close and powerful one. Bono's campaigning work nowadays is really a branch of the Gates Foundation. It's very hard to describe it in any other way. It gets the majority of its funding there and takes its campaigning leads very much from the work of Gates. And again, we'll have a little bit more about that later. Steve Jobs. This kind of indicative of Steve Jobs, by the way, sold his penthouse in New York to Bono a few years ago. But Bono has worked, Bono helped with the launch of iTunes. He was involved in U2, launched a special iPod. And when there came this moment, which I'll talk about later, when Bono sort of is trying to combine a corporate sales pitch with the needs of people with AIDS, Apple was one of the first companies on board. And then there's this. The relationship in this case is only, in a small way, the relationship between Bono and his wife, Ali. This image contains other kinds of relationships. I've tried to unpack it in the text of the book insofar as I can, but this was an ad that was first appeared in 2010 and ran in sort of elite magazines for quite a while, usually as a double-page spread. It was for Louis Vuitton. These bags that they're carrying cost about $1,000 each. And the tagline here is, "Every journey began in Africa." And so we've got the plane in the background. We've basically got a sort of a moment of autobiography in a way, because in Bono's version of his kind of developing activism, his trip to Africa in 1985 with Ali, where they went and worked in an orphanage in Ethiopia for a few weeks, he sort of describes that as the beginning. So we can imagine them sort of landing somewhere in northern Ethiopia here, and just out of the shot are the poor children who they're about to bring their amazing grace and teach some songs as well. Bono tells the story of how he taught the children to sing songs about saving seeds from one year to the next. But the other thing is that this image happens in the context of a partnership with Louis Vuitton, which isn't just a sponsorship deal. Vuitton, or LVMH, Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy. So if you want excess, you've got in those initials, dripping from each letter. Vuitton had bought a majority stake in Ali Hewson's cosmetics company, Nude, and also a 49% stake in her clothing company, Eden. So this is essentially this is a marriage photo of Bono and Ali with the company for which they're advertising here. Ali and Bono wear Eden. So we've got, within the picture, we've got them promoting her clothing line. Ali carries the Louis Vuitton Eden collaborative bag. Profits and Ali and Bono's fee benefit the Cotton Conservation Initiative Uganda. Another interesting relationship, because the Cotton Conservation Initiative Uganda, which Eden is involved in, is a project that they work on with the American NGO Invisible Children. Invisible Children, if you remember, produced the Coney 2012 video last year and were pretty widely discredited among anybody with any cop about the reality. But Invisible Children is an American NGO that essentially, its main purpose is to encourage American military intervention in Central and East Africa, but also has very strong evangelical links and notorious homophobic links as well. So a whole set of relationships, a relationship with Africa, and that's probably the most, in many ways, the most horrifying part of this, the use of Africa in this way as a kind of a commercial prop. As I wrote in the book, the only thing that redeems it is that it's so fake looking. It's so utterly, even its color palette is so artificial. And there was a video as soon as this ad started running. There was a video immediately available online that showed the plane being wheeled in and its wheels being sprayed with fake mud, and the Bono and Ali arriving in their 4x4 and mwah, mwah, with Annie Leibovitz, and they had the whole the whole shtick. So it is very fake, but it nonetheless is, as I say, it's a marriage picture with a lot of partners: Invisible Children, Vuitton, and Africa itself. And it all started, of course, around that time that they first went to Africa with Live Aid. And at Live Aid, really, Bono's sort of, the reason we remember Bono from Live Aid is because he got down off the stage. And that sort of became part of our sort of sense of his sort of morality, his integrity, his persona was about, not being up there, about bridging that space, coming down and being with, he goes down and he dances with a girl who is pulled from the audience, a young woman who is pulled from the audience. And there became a myth that he'd rescued her, indeed, from the crush of the audience. But if you move forward 20 years from Live Aid to Make Poverty History in 2005, Bono and Geldof are no longer talking about coming down from the stage. They're very much part of the podium party. This image was from a photo shoot promoting an MTV appearance that Blair and Geldof made just before the summit, in which they were explaining how it was that they were about to solve the problems of the world's poor with that summit. Now, 2005, you may remember there was a war going on at the time, and it was actually going very badly, and Britain and America were involved in wholesale slaughter in Iraq. What might have been a massive anti-war protest in Scotland became a kind of a celebration, a welcome party for the world's elite, and Bono was central to that. This is, I think, is an indicative illustration of what that. First of all, you have a kind of a newspaper sponsoring a protest, and it's not really a protest at all. Look at these figures of the G8 here. It's caricature without mockery. It was celebration. It was, these are the, look at the lovely smile on Blair there. These are the guys who are going to sort out poverty. I mean, Bono had been calling Tony Blair and Gordon Brown the Lennon and McCartney of global development. And it was Bono's idea. Bono was essentially the spin doctor for this G8 summit. It was Bono's idea that the summit would produce a formal anti-poverty declaration. And when it did produce that, it turns out that Bono embraced it. He said, this is it. The world is a much better place for this. And the New York Times said that Bono's embrace of that was treated with the solemnity of a Security Council resolution. And it was true. Bono was taken very seriously as a campaigner, but he was effectively on the inside. He went to number 10 Downing Street a few days before the summit, met with some of the chief negotiators from the different countries to make sure that everybody was on message. Many of the development organizations who had been involved with Make Poverty History immediately rejected that summit outcome as a travesty. And Tony Blair's memoirs recall how he used Bono and Geldof to sell the outcome of the summit, even when the development groups were accusing the G8 of betraying them. And indeed, within a few months of this, essentially, Bono and Geldof have broken with most of the global development community. There's a story in the London Independent within 2 months of this saying, celebrities hijacked poverty campaign, say, development groups. Meanwhile, Jim Kerr of Simple Minds said that Bono was sucking up to creeps. How can Bono contemplate praising and backslapping Blair, whose slippery hands are dripping in the blood of Iraqi men, women, and children? It was a distraction from the war. It was also its outcome, which was, as the organization suggested, something of a cross between a con job and an accounting trick. And Bono was completely on board with that. It was a moment in which a really proper activist, Bono still had credibility and a reputation for integrity at that time, could have stepped away. Could have been something like what the Quakers did here in Ireland in 1848 when they very publicly, turned down £100 from the British government for Irish famine relief because they were sick of providing cover for Britain's unjust policies in Ireland. Bono could have done that, but it just wouldn't have been Bono. This is the great Robert Rubin, as Bono described him. He was the guru of a generation of Goldman Sachs executives, and he's the man that Bono credits with creating the idea for the Red marketing campaign, which immediately follows on the fiasco of Make Poverty History. Red was an idea that if you sell some products with a special brand on them and you save a few pennies of the sale are going to go to help AIDS in the developing world, you sell a lot of products and you'll get a lot of money to fight AIDS. And Bono launched the campaign by going on a shopping spree with Oprah, who called him the reigning king of hope. I mean, I can describe the campaign, but the best summary of it probably comes here in this interview with Laura Powers-Freeling, who's the head of American Express, or Amex UK. The involvement of U2's lead singer, a key part of the company's aim to be cool and sexy. Terms not normally associated, etc. The head of Amex UK is still singing the rock star's praises. Bono said this beautiful thing in Davos. Bono is a regular fixture, of course, at Davos, where the Global Economic Summit takes place. He said this card, he was holding up a red Amex credit card, is not about what you have, it's about who you are. So that's Bono, having been a spokesmodel for Blair and Bush and Brown in 2005. It was only natural that by early 2006 he'd be a spokesmodel for American Express, a credit card company. These sort of philanthropic partnerships, charitable partnerships, are very common in the world of credit cards, of course. But anyway, this is not primarily a history lesson. I want to try to engage with what Bono's doing now, and I want to sort of get toward, how am I doing for time? All right. This is Bono having lunch with Michelle during the G8, I would describe this as something of a demotion for Bono. This is basically the next time the G8 was in the UK after the Make Poverty History in 2005. Instead of being up there as a spokesman for the world, embracing the outcome of the summit, he's having lunch with the First Lady in Dublin. And I think the tax avoidance question was probably part of the reason for that Bono was, kept relatively inconspicuous. But the One campaign, Bono's campaign, was quite busy in a quiet way during the G8 this year. And they put together this thing called Agit 8. And Agit 8 was essentially a campaign to assemble a bunch of old good political songs and get them covered by a lot of hip young artists and protest basically nothing whatsoever. They called it agitate. I would have called it denigrate, desecrate, and misappropriate, and ingratiate, of course, because largely what they were doing was ingratiating. I get emails from the One campaign. They treat me as, Bono will often say, we have 4 million members, who, blah, 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 basically everyone on their email list. You can join the One campaign by texting at a U2 concert. I joined the One campaign by sending a journalistic query to the website that was never answered, but they added me to their mailing list, and now I'm a member of the One campaign. So I got the email from the European director of One, Adrian Lovett. What an amazing 2 weeks. We called on world leaders to back Africa's food revolution and unleash a transparency revolution, and they acted. I'll talk to you in a minute about the food revolution and the transparency revolution. And there's Lovett, a photo on the email of Lovett handing a petition to David Cameron. The petition basically demands that the British government and the G8 do exactly what they were planning to do anyway. So this is not protest. It's sort of like what Stephen Colbert might call protestee. And the European Commission President Barroso even took our record of protest songs all the way from Brussels to the summit. So but that's how effective it was as protest. It was kind of the soothing soundtrack for the leaders at the G8 summit. All that was missing was Bono singing 2468, Who Do We Appreciate? Okay, so the food revolution and transparency. George Monbiot has written about this recently in a couple of pieces for The Guardian, that One's underlying agenda, by the way, in the One campaign, which is Bono's organization, has a board of directors that is largely composed of millionaires, corporate aristocrats, American enforcers. Monbiot said that it looks like the sort of organization that John le Carré or Robert Harris might have invented. And actually, to kind of go with that sort of sinister side of it, here's Bono appearing on African Big Brother on behalf of One, putting out a message about African agriculture. But what is this message about African agriculture? What's this food revolution? Well, One is, along with a number of NGOs and companies, including Monsanto, Cargill, and other American and international agribusiness companies, involved in a campaign called the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition, which Monbiot describes as a new imperial land grab in Africa. Oxfam, which has worked with Bono in the past and is hardly on the radical fringes of global development, says that this alliance focuses too heavily on the role of the private sector, one-size-fits-all technologies, and that it addresses a question that hungry people haven't asked. It's ironic, Bono to be working with Monsanto because, as I said earlier, he was teaching those Ethiopian children songs in 1985 about how to save the seeds for the next planting season. When Monsanto gets its grips in Africa, they'll have to buy seed for the next planting season. The solutions, I won't go into this, I'm running out of time, so I won't go into this too much, but the solutions put forward by the Gates Foundation, by One, and by this new alliance basically are predicated on a notion that Africa's agricultural problem is about production and not about distribution. And I think there's a very good case that it's a problem about distribution and about production that's been undermined by exactly the sort of policies that the IMF, the World Bank, and the Washington Consensus have forced on African countries. Now, it is the case that, that Bono has been somewhat on the defensive about some of these things. This interview in The Observer a few weeks ago, I think, was sort of at least partly inspired by the kind of arguments that were going on around this book and others. I have to say, my name is on the cover of this book, but I consider the book to be very much a collaborative piece of work. It's got about 400 footnotes in it, for one thing, and it really is based on years of really good scholarship, activism, research about the work that that Bono does. So I'm the collector as much as anything else. I'm the front man of this particular piece of research. So this Bono's basic defense here, I guess, was you know, that, well, AIDS basically is the major source of his defense. It's basically either I worked with George Bush, or you see that woman over there, she dies, and so does her baby. You know, and that's the kind of the equation that we're left with. That he had to do that. He had to work with those people because that's how you save those kids. But we should be capable of measuring the effectiveness of possible alternatives without being called utopians. African countries could have done more about AIDS, about poverty, and do it for themselves if debt relief and aid weren't saddled with the traditional Washington conditions, the weakening of the state sector, the abolition of agricultural tariffs, privatization, etc. The number of AIDS cases continues to grow. More than 1 million dead in sub-Saharan Africa already this year from AIDS. In West Africa, more than 80% of infected pregnant women aren't getting the essential antiretroviral drugs that would prevent them from passing on the disease to their children. So if that's success, I'd hate to see their idea of failure. And meanwhile, the American evangelicals, who Bono, by his own boasts, helped usher into Africa to fight AIDS, are transforming many countries' sexual politics. I was in the States recently, and I met lawyers, immigration lawyers, who help LGBT and HIV-positive asylum seekers. And they're seeing more and more people who are having to flee the very countries that Bono has worked in and helped these American right-wingers into because of new homophobic legislation and new homophobic, including in places like Uganda, new homophobic social atmosphere that's being created by the powerful and highly financed presence of these elements. So that's, okay, he mentioned transparency there as well, or One mentioned transparency, and it's true. I think we need to deal with this kind of question of transparency. One did campaign to improve the openness of multinational contracts with developing world governments, but transparency is not always a radical egalitarian demand. We shouldn't assume that, you know, that those who are pushing for greater transparency are on our side somehow. Transparency is often a demand by people who are looking to be new entrants into a market that has been dominated by other cozy old arrangements. Transparency, in other words, is a capitalist demand in many cases. If you look at the Transparency International, which is probably the NGO that most closely represents this kind of trend within capitalism to demand transparency, if you look at their index, the countries in South America that have probably done most to ensure that the benefits of their mineral wealth go to their people, Bolivia, Venezuela, Ecuador, are all ranked very low by Transparency International. So we shouldn't assume that transparency is necessarily always a good thing. And it actually goes, it's of a piece with the alliance of Bono and those like him with the part of the capitalist elite that we sometimes call the new economy, Gates, Facebook, etc. Kind of hipster capitalism. Web entrepreneurs, neoliberal politicians, rock stars, everyone's all creative together, and they're creatively solving the problems of the world. In fact, one academic, Alan Finlayson, has called this Bonoism, which I think is actually a really good coinage. Unfortunately, I didn't see it until after I'd read the book, after I'd written the book, sorry. And one interesting piece that I think describes Bonoism recently by Thomas Frank says, TED Talks are lying to you. TED Talk, Bono is a great practitioner of these these gatherings where you come and you talk about your favorite cause for a few minutes. I did a critique of this talk that was published on Counterpunch in March, and I know I'm basically out of time, so I'm not going to go through that in any detail here, but I invite you to have a look at that. Basically, the most cursory reading of the World Bank Global Development Report indicates that if you want to talk about what works in sort of bringing about a reduction in poverty, you would look to China, you would look to Latin America. This is with a bit of cherry-picked data and with a lot of bending of the truth, it seems to me. But if we look at China from 97.8% to 29.8% of population below $2 a day, Latin America and the Caribbean, after kind of cruising along at sort of the low to mid 20%, down in the last decade to 12.5%. Meanwhile, sub-Saharan Africa, 72, 74, 76, 78, 77, 77, 76, and then only recently dropping back to something like where it started 30 years previously. And we know that since 2008, things have got worse again because of the global crisis. So, and in terms of the actual total numbers, which you see in this table, has been a doubling of the population below in sub-Saharan Africa because of the increase in population. It actually stays in, it stays roughly stable in population terms, in percentage terms. So Philanthro-capitalism, that's what Bono stands for. By the way, just on those, just quickly, in 1981, 10.5% of the world's extremely poor lived in sub-Saharan Africa. In 2008, it was more than 30%. So in terms of an index of where anti-poverty work is succeeding or failing, you'd look to East Asia, you would look to Latin America, you wouldn't look to where Bono has been at work. Philanthro-capitalism. This was the best quote that I came across that sort of describes what's going on here. As more and more lives and communities are destroyed by the system that creates vast amounts of wealth for the few, the more heroic it sounds to give back. It's conscience laundering, feeling better about accumulating more than any one person can possibly need to live on by sprinkling a little round as an act of charity. But it keeps the existing structure of inequality in place. The rich sleep better at night, while others get just enough to keep the pot from boiling over. Nearly every time someone feels better by doing good on the other side of the world or street, and that's a very important point because Bono is all about the idea that there's a rich world and a poor world, and ignores the reality that most of the very poor people in the world live in not very poor countries. They live across the street rather than across the world. Someone else is further locked into a system that will not allow the true flourishing of his or her nature the opportunity to live a joyful and fulfilled life. That's Peter Buffett, the son of Warren Buffett, who Warren Buffett has put in charge of a major foundation. And he was writing in denunciation. Essentially, he's come out in opposition to what he's been doing all his life and what his father's been doing all his life, the charitable industrial complex. He says it's a scam. It's basically a scam. It's a way. It's conscience laundering, and it's a way to ensure that that we keep the structure of inequality in place just enough to keep the pot from boiling over. It's a brilliant confession. It's actually a piece well worth reading by Peter Buffett. He goes on to say, with more business-minded folks getting in on the act, so this is really philanthro-capitalism, business principles are trumpeted as an important element to add to the philanthropic center. I now hear people asking at meetings, what's the ROI when it comes to alleviating human suffering? Return on investment. What's the return on investment? What's this really about? Microlending, financial literacy. People will learn how to integrate into our system of debt and repayment with interest. Well, exactly. Exactly. This is about ensuring that the world's poor become part of the system of, are more closely integrated into the system of global exploitation that we know only all too well here. And this was one of the great lines from that piece by Buffett as well. He says, inside any important philanthropy meeting, you witness heads of state meeting with investment managers and corporate leaders. All are searching for answers with their right hand to problems that others in the room have created with their left. Bono is essentially, for me, is the mascot, as I say, the spokesmodel for this set of relationships, for the idea. And, and Buffett offers his philanthropic peers the benefit of the doubt here. He says that these people are searching for answers. Fair enough. We can give them the benefit of the doubt. I'll give Bono the benefit of the doubt. He's searching for answers. But we can also point out that given where he's searching and with whom, it's no wonder that he still hasn't found what he's looking for. Well, thank you. I really great discussion. I'm sorry I went long with my talk, which put people under undue pressure in terms of your own contributions. I really appreciate them. Geldof is even more boring than Bono. I couldn't possibly suggest a book on Geldof. I think it's really important. I'm sort of working backwards. It's important, that point about the deepening the grip of neoliberalism, because I think it deepens it here as well. I think that the continuing of this message in light of what we've seen in Western capitalism over the last 5 years can't be an accident, that you can keep talking about, about markets being the savior, about, about financial architecture benefiting everybody. I mean, it's just, and it's because, to go back to the first question, Martin's, I mean, it's because that he does provide what I think is important cover to the system, brings something that is of value to the system. That's why it's worthwhile doing the book. That's why it's worthwhile having these conversations, because there'd be no point just to say Bono's a pox. I mean, I agree, there is a bit of that in the book, right enough, but but really the point is, like, let's recognize the system for what it is and therefore what it means to stand for it. Foundations, the likes of Gates, we have to understand where they fit in structurally, not only in the developing world, but in the first world as well. Essentially, it's a way to avoid tax. That's why rich multi-billionaires set up foundations. It's a way to stash your money away without paying tax on it. So this system is really stitched into the fabric of a kind of maintenance of a powerful elite. It's not I just heard a story the other day that Goldman Sachs has increased the percentage of its earnings that it gives to charity quite considerably in recent years. So these elites know that they're under scrutiny, they're under pressure, and this is one of their safety valves for responding to it. So there is something at stake here. Bono, on the other hand, is sometimes a handy scapegoat. I think the government sometimes uses U2 as a scapegoat on the tax question. John Burton decided to have a go at U2 for its tax avoidance. It seems to me that if a government was really interested in stopping tax avoidance, it wouldn't be slagging off celebrities. It would be actually doing something about the legal framework that makes it possible. That was UK Uncut who did the campaign at Glastonbury, and it was really good. Just on the poverty history, the history of poverty. In 1820, the per capita wealth gap between the poorest and richest countries in the world was 3 to 1. In 1950, it was 35 to 1. In 1997, it was 74 to 1. So the last couple of centuries, and the last 40 years has only been an acceleration of that, there's been a monstrous appropriation of the resources of the poor world. There's absolutely no question that today's aid and debt relief for the developing world only represents a tiny, fractional giving back of what continues to be taken. That's the fundamental reality, and that's the one that's very hard to view if you're Bono and you want to provide cover for the system. And I think it's that some of the negative response to the book, people are perfectly entitled not to like the book. I have no problem. I don't like it very much myself at times. I'm sick of it. But I think that one of the reasons that you have to see it. On the one hand, everyone knows that in Ireland Bono gets a lot of flack and that people don't like Bono. But on the other hand, the system that I'm trying to have a go at is a little bigger than Bono. How do you do a sympathetic interview in the Indo with someone who says philanthro-capitalism is a load of shit and these rich people who are taking more from the third world than they're giving, if your newspaper is owned by Dennis O'Brien? So I think that there's a fundamental problem that a book like this runs up against that is not necessarily to do with whether I can write or whether Bono is a good person, but it's to do with where it fits into the larger structure of capitalism. The great question about what are the alternatives. I know people have attempted to answer it, but you know what? I don't knock Bono for doing it the way that he does. I think that I understand why he does it, and I think it's also important for us to understand why we should do it differently. As I said earlier, and I really mean this, that if I had got his access, I'm sure that if I got asked to the White House and I'd looked around, as I said, he has access to the commanding heights of the global power structure, and the view must be fantastic. And you know, you could really convince yourself up there that what you're doing is good. So on a personal level, of course he's trying to do something. And as I said, one of the first myths I dispelled is that he's just a glory seeker. I think that the point of critiquing it isn't to say, he's not doing anything. The point is to say, what he's doing, where does it fit with your worldview? Because we get, you know, a lot of people, you know, who are U2 fans going back have this kind of like thing that, you know, they want to go with him. In fact, Bono in that interview says, I thought our fans would reject us for working with the power structure, but it turns out we've been able to take them with us. They've gone on this journey, a political journey with us. And I think that it's important that those people who have followed Bono on this journey understand where they're going. And understand, you know, and so all the book is for is to clarify that. To my mind, it's basically a fact book, and it's for people who think of themselves, I think it's largely for people who think of themselves as being on the left, who want to believe that Bono is doing the right thing, and you know, are clearly taken by his sincerity, and that they need to clarify what it is that he represents. So that's all. That's for me, you know. And he's pretty good at sounding plausibly like us. We might not think so, but he always says, like he said in the Gabo interview that he did a few months ago, I'm all about justice, not charity. You know, so it does sound like us. And in the interview with The Observer, he sort of talks, he speaks a little bit in the language of the left. It's too bad that there's no alternative to capitalism. You know, maybe that's to be regretted, but there's no alternative. You know, and so it's like when he goes on American evangelical radio, he can quote scripture. When he talks to The Observer, he can sound slightly Marxist. You know, and his history is quite influenced by the left. His 80s politics certainly came out of a kind of a liberation theology sympathy. So he's our distant cousin on the evolutionary tree, and we have to understand where that branch has actually got to a point where we need to cut it off. You know, and so. You know, and also in relation to sort of imperialism, that connection to invisible children is very important. And in that Observer interview, some of his highest praise was for the U.S. military and the wisdom of its approach to the enemy in Africa, and he clearly sympathizes with that approach. Bono talks about having an inside-out philosophy. You know, that you work inside, you work outside. You know, being close to power is not the same as cozying up to power. But my argument is that he's very much on the inside. And he basically comes out only to assure the rest of us that those inside are on the right track. You know, we're dealing with it. And as I say, I don't blame him. It must be nice inside. But you know, it's for those of us who are outside, it's really important that we get a clear view of that space and understand how it differs from our own. All right.